Oftentimes, when people are pregnant, the concern is, how do I make my yoga practice work for my body? Alexandra is not currently pregnant. That ship has sailed for both of us. However, let's imagine that she is, and she is going to demonstrate some poses to help you figure out how to modify for your changing body. So for standing poses, Alexandra will take a wide stance, and I'll have her come into just a warrior two position for right now. She'll stretch her arms out. If you ever need to shorten your stance a little bit to feel a little bit more stable, you can always do that. Sometimes poses will ask you to come into a position with your arms down on either side. So if Alexandra were going to transition into a lunge position, normally she'd come down and have her hands on either side of her feet. But because she's pregnant, she'll place her hands on blocks either to either side of her front foot, or she'll place the blocks both to the inside of her front foot. So the key to making any sort of changes in a standing pose, or really any pose when pregnant, is to create as much space for your body as you need, right? So obviously bringing your belly over your leg is a tricky thing to do when you're pregnant. So this provides a little bit more space using blocks for any sort of standing pose. Make sure you have plenty of props available. To come into a forward fold, again, sometimes there's a little bit of a trickiness because of your body. So Alexandra will take her feet a little bit wider than she might normally take her feet apart, and then fold forward, giving her belly plenty of space. The blocks can also be helpful for as your body changes. You might not have quite the extent of hamstring flexibility that you might normally have because your lower back and your hamstrings are very closely connected, and folding forward becomes a little bit more challenging and difficult. The same thing is true for any sort of seated forward fold. So if Alexandra comes down and has a seat on the ground and comes into a wide-legged position with her feet, then one thing that might be helpful here, the psoas muscle is the muscle that connects the trunk of the body to the lower body. We have it on both sides of our body, and it's a really crucial muscle for birth, being both strong and flexible. So sometimes sitting up on a blanket when you're in a seated position, or even a bolster if you need a little bit more space, can be helpful for providing that room for your low back, for your psoas muscles, and for your hamstrings. When you fold forward in a seated forward fold, you want to make sure that you have plenty of room for your belly. And as you come forward, you can always utilize the blocks again if they're helpful in providing stability and making sure that you have plenty of space. Yeah, and finding a really good balance between, utilizing the strength that's required to carry this pregnant body, and also, surrendering into an easeful place where you feel supported and comfortable is really important. Twisting is something else that we do in normal everyday life during pregnancy, and it's certainly not something that can be avoided, and it can be really nice in helping to find different rotation of the spine and give you some flexibility there. As you get further along in your pregnancy journey, twisting toward your leg can become a little bit trickier because of space constraints. Alexandra, not pregnant, can do it very easily, but if you are pregnant and do have a belly, you might extend one leg. So she'll extend her left leg, and with her right leg bent, she'll take her right elbow to the inside of her right thigh. She can give her belly plenty of space by moving her foot to the side. Then she'll bring her left hand back behind her and twist away from the obstacle, in this case, her leg. So anytime that there's a twist that doesn't feel comfortable for your body, you might make the twist move in the opposite direction so that you're twisting away from your leg rather than towards your leg. Back bends are tricky during pregnancy sometimes because there is already increased weight at your low back. There's certainly not an impossibility, and sometimes it can feel really nice to get into your front body and get into the thoracic spine, the upper part of your back. So there are two different modifications we'll demonstrate here for back bends. Both times we'll use the bolster. So Alexandra will grab the bolster, and we have a helicopter overhead. She'll place the bolster toward the middle of the mat. We'll do camel, so turn it this way. not camel, cobra. We're gonna edit. We might edit the helicopter. Yeah. All right, so from here, Alexandra is actually going to turn around and place her knees right behind the bolster and walk her hands so they're placed right in front of the bolster. She's coming into hands and knees with the bolster in front of her. And then she'll lower her thighs down onto the bolster, walking her hands a little bit further forward. And this variation of any sort of prone pose where you're opening the front body, using a bolster can be really helpful in giving your belly the space, giving your back body the space. So she can come into a variation of Sphinx pose here, cobra that she was just doing, upward facing dog. And being able to stretch and open the front body while you're pregnant is really a nice thing to be able to do, and sometimes tricky when you don't have the support of something underneath your legs. The next way that you can modify for some back bending positions is Alexandra will come up onto her knees and she'll place the bolster behind her on top of her calves. Then I will help her out here because it's a little tricky once you're in that position. Have everything close by. Place blocks right on top of the bolster. So this is if you were going to come into camel pose, or even if there was a pose that was a back bend that's being taught in a practice that you're in and you'd prefer to do something different. This allows you opening in the front body without placing any weight on your belly, and it also is a little bit gentler than coming into bridge pose or wheel pose, particularly if you're feeling any sort of faintness or dizziness when you're lying on your back. This is a great alternative. Placing a bolster on top of your calves, placing blocks on top of the bolster, using your hands to help lift your sternum forward and open the front body. And that's really what we're trying to get into, is the upper back in any sort of back bend, regardless of what it is. The next pose that Alexandra will demonstrate is a seated hip opener. So she'll come into Baddha Konasana. She'll come to the ground and have a seat, keeping her blocks very close by. Just like the seated wide-legged forward fold, Alexandra can always sit up on a blanket to give the hip flexors a little bit more space. And then your blocks can be used either directly under your knees or a little bit further back underneath the upper thighs, so that the adductor muscles, the muscles that help to draw your legs together, can find a little bit more stretch and space in any sort of seated hip opener. So your props are your friends, for sure. The next thing we'll talk about are balancing poses. So balance is constantly shifting when you're pregnant because your body is constantly changing and your center of gravity is constantly shifting. So it's really helpful when you're in any sort of balance pose to have a wall or something stable nearby that can serve as a kind of a secondary support for you. Alexandra will come into tree pose here, and I'm going to stand up because I'm a little bit more stable when I'm standing. And she'll place her right from the floor and bring her left foot up into tree pose, just using me as a sense of support and safety and security as she comes into tree pose. Yay. The next thing that we often hear questions about are inversions in pregnancy. And the biggest issue in any sort of inversion in pregnancy is balance. So for the same reason, we offer the possibility of coming close to a wall when you're doing any sort of inversion. I'm not going to serve as a wall for Alexandra here, but if you want to come into headstand, if you have that in your practice, or handstand, and you feel comfortable still doing that, just make sure that you have a wall close by or something stable and supportive that perhaps isn't another person. Thanks. I don't know how I don't know either. I was just like, bleh.